connect the job And developers being onboarded into this work is a big sticking point because they kind of have to learn how this enormous system works before they can do any real work. I started Aligent as a backend developer, and after 6 months of how one of these giant frameworks worked, I was very ready to work on something else. So we have started working in a different way, which is we build each of these integrations as a really small application that talks to the core through generally whatever the standard API is, and talks to the external platform. This gives us a much greater level of independence on when we can deploy, how much each of these systems can scale. One system might only need to run once a week, but it does a heap of work in those 2 or 3 hours. Another system might be doing little bits of work all the time. They don't have to talk to the same database. They don't have to run on the same infrastructure. And in fact, we use cloud technologies so that basically we put all that work off onto AWS and we say, look, just run this thing as much as it needs to run. And onboarding, we see some improvements there. We're still there's a lot to learn because we're working with new tools and new technologies. So I'm sure these 3 will talk about the learning curve that's involved there. But already I'm seeing we can at least bring people on very quickly into a small change on a small system and have them not feel like they have to learn the rest of the universe at the same time. We're also seeing gains in visibility and usability for clients. We can give them access to just a small system instead of it all being buried in this giant framework that they have no interest in learning how it works. We have some clients who are comfortable enough now that they actually go in and run processes and debug things and so on. And that's something I don't think we would ever have seen with the old way of doing things. And we are more flexible in our choice of language and tools. For the moment, we're not really making use of that. We just write in TypeScript. We use something called Serverless Framework for managing all our deployment, and we put everything on Amazon. But we are working forward. We've got some projects in the pipeline that are using different things in those spaces. So what are we building? Daniel's been working on something that handles product exports from the client's preferred product information management system and imports it to some of their backends. Ashley's been working on getting orders from a website and doing all the work to create a customer required for the order in another system and then give the system the order for that customer. Phil's been working on some very complicated pricing and ordering systems where we have to cache a lot of data from another system and then do some complicated maths to work out what the cheapest price the customer is allowed to pay is. And I believe that's pretty much all I've got. So I guess we might kick off. Phil, how did you get into microservices? What were you doing beforehand at Adelaide?
I was doing front end, and I guess kind of the way I got into it is at the end just said, would you like to be microservices? And I just said, yeah, okay.
Was that the extent of the discussion?
Pretty much.
Did it just sound cool, or?
I don't even know what it was. I think I was just like, yeah, I will try it.
We might want to work on that.
That was a bit different because I was copying looks. So it was kind of onboarding with it. But yeah, so I guess it just started with, would you like to learn this new thing? And then I did go through like a Udemy course. We kind of like a built-in like a learning path for the serverless framework. So we have our own, it's basically selection of things in Udemy, like this bit's good, this bit's good, this bit's good. Just pick and choose the actual relevant bits. Because at least in our case, we had a bit of felt like there was a bit of a time crunch when we were doing the card stuff. Kind of just learned the bare minimum to get it across the line. But since then, I've been doing a lot of learning in our spare time. Well, not spare time, but while at work, we get additional time to do learning and things like that. So just from there, you just kind of build and build and build, and now I feel pretty comfortable. Started working on more complex things like what describes.
What's the biggest difference between front end and microservices?
I would say there's a lot of instant gratification in front end, where you style something immediately, you're running it locally, you can say, oh, that looks awesome, that matches exactly, that's perfect, it's working. There's a lot more, I would say there's more planning and thinking that goes into microservices, because you need to think about how you want to split things up, what the solution will look like. It's much more obvious in front end. You know, we're working with React mostly, and it's kind of like, okay, I'll just do it with React and I'll add some style. That's, you know, typically pretty often.
Styling is definitely a big one for me. I'm very happy to not be touching the CSS.
I don't mind it.
Has anyone here done any website development, any front development? Yeah, there tends to be a big split between the people who like making things look good and the ones who would rather never touch any CSS again in their lives, in my experience.
I think it's tedious until you feel like you've learned enough to just basically do it without thinking about it. Although you might reach that point still.
Most of my front end dev was designed for IE7, so that was also not
A
a
big
lot
part
of
of
fun.
it. Yeah, so now I'm working on stuff for another client like Todd described, and it's been quite difficult, I suppose, but it's been difficult in a fun way. Like we were talking about on the way here. I'm not sure if any of you have done anything with top coded before, or like hacker rank, all those things where you just basically go online problems. They're like, here, sort this array backwards or whatever trivial thing, usually kind of just for the sake of it. But it's in microservices so far, I felt like it's rather than someone gives you a design and they say, here, implement this, it's here's a problem, create a solution, and it's a lot more like you get to go through the fun logic of working out, oh, I've got this, how do I make it become this, or whatever you need to do. But,
Yep. Cool. Ashley's also come from front end. Does that describe your experience mostly, or?
Yeah, I think so. I think some of the like biggest differences between front end and microservices is like the issues that you deal with in front end are more just around like how to style things correctly, like getting the functionality working. Whereas a lot of the things with microservices, because you're dealing with like lots of different tech stacks, lots of different APIs, a lot of the problems you're dealing with is just trying to like work through the other technologies you're working with. So for example, like the code I'm currently working on is basically just taking data from one service and moving it into another one. And like working with those APIs is the bulk of the like difficulty of that work, rather than like styling and moving around the things that I have made, which is more the case in front end. I think the other thing is there's a big gap in microservices between like writing the code and testing the code. And I think that's because, like, at least with serverless, the local environment for that isn't really reliable for a lot of projects. So you kind of have to like write the code and deploy it and then test it. And it's definitely different. It's a very different set of problems to be working around. And I think as Phil touched on a bit, there's a lot less of the instant gratification you get like on front end, where it's like you write some code and it's just immediately there on your local environment. But I think it is the case we're kind of dealing with more interesting problems from like a data perspective in a way. Like I'm not just making components and shifting things around on the web page and like fixing bugs that are there. Often I'll spend my time like sitting down and working out the best way to like take some data and transform it and put it somewhere else. I don't know. I personally find those kind of problems more interesting, I'd say.
It's definitely a heavier system design aspect.
Yeah.
A lot of kind of. Daniel's come from DevOps, which is basically the other side of the developer world.
Yeah.
How have you found it?
I mean, my onboarding experience was almost identical to Phil because we got thrown onto the same project. So we did a lot of pair programming at the start. I get familiar with it. There's quite a few similarities between DevOps and microservices in the way that they're both very much cloud centric. So I was already familiar with AWS, which was nice, but you do use a lot of different services in microservices. So previously we had used like virtual machines and stuff in AWS, whereas microservices is very much serverless stuff. So things like Lambda functions, Dynamo, things that you don't need to spin up infrastructure for. It's just sort of you say, hey, AWS, I want this, and it just goes, cool, have this. You don't have to worry about what you're building in terms of infrastructure. So that was different. But there are similarities, things like permissions, as much as we don't really like them in serverless, they tend to get in the way, but it's nice having that background. So I think I found the AWS transition pretty simple, but TypeScript I hadn't worked with much before, so that was interesting trying to learn that. and serverless framework as well. That was a big learning curve, trying to get back into development. It hadn't done for a while. Yeah, it was good though. The first project we worked on was fairly straightforward. It was pretty much just making API calls, I think, was all it was, which was nice. And then we could just focus on the actual serverless framework and getting stuff deployed rather than trying to focus too much on planning all this crazy logic. And yeah, whereas the service I'm working on now, the products importer or exporter, that is a much more complicated system. It's good coming up with those designs. You get to plan out your whole system and work out how everything's going to work. And that's really enjoyable, but that would be very intimidating as a first project. So it's nice to have one that was fairly simple to start off with, and then you sort of dive into something a bit more complex.
Yeah.
A bit being an understatement.
What's the most complicated part of that one?
The most
This
complicated
is a
part.
Kenio, right?
Yeah. I think it's more just trying to understand how a Kenio gives you data and how Magento wants data, and translating that. Because I didn't come from Magento experience or Magento background, so I didn't know much about Magento until this project. I also didn't know much about a Kenio until this project started. So I didn't really know what products looked in either systems. I sort of had to work out what they look like and what they're meant to look like when I send it to different systems. And then we have another system. So Magento is their backend, and they also have a second backend system, which again has slightly different requirements. So you're trying to sort of make product data compatible for both of them. There's a lot of complexities in that conversion.
Yeah, I think Ashley touched on this. One of the big challenges moving into microservices is you go from generally working on pretty well documented systems where you know that one system, whether it's React in front end or Magento in back end or something like that, and you have to learn how 3 or 4 different systems work, and they might be very unique implementations of just one option in a big market of options. And so there's a lot of research and discovery and troubleshooting just to get basic things to work.
And often things are not documented very well.
Yeah.
The Magento documentation for the APIs is pretty terrible. I've gone to some of them.
Better documented ones
Yeah.
we work with.
I've often looked at API calls I need to make, and there's nothing. It doesn't tell you. It tells you briefly what the input is, but you just get random errors that aren't documented. It's like, what am I doing wrong? And you just got no idea. And then the other system, the other backend I'm talking to, they have 0 documentation, so I'm just guessing. There's a lot of that, which is a bit frustrating. But yeah, that's definitely a struggle, is dealing with undocumented systems or not very well documented systems.
We have someone else who couldn't make it today, unfortunately. They have come from what we call a business analyst or a technical analyst background, so they're actually not done any programming beforehand. They were very strong in the system design aspect, which is a big part of microservices as well. So the primary challenges there were obvious. They were essentially learning programming from scratch, like some of you might be doing here. I don't know. On very much the same kind of compressed timeline. Like, okay, you got a couple of weeks to work out how to write something that doesn't have bugs and can work. And we know you're good at everything else, but you've still got to be able to do this part of the job.
And that was a very complicated system.
That was a bit, yeah. I have opinions about how complicated the systems they've had to work with. But I think that's been pretty successful so far as well. We have some people moving into this adjacent from, we have a new person we've hired who's come from a QA perspective, which I think is actually a really strong background for microservices, because there's so much of this troubleshooting and research and development and working out exactly what works and what doesn't. I think that's a really strong skill set to come to space with, provided you have a little bit of programming experience as well. What's been the most fun for you? It sounds like the system design.
Yeah, I say, so with microservices, a lot of the time you're completely building something from scratch, like a small little service. So you have a lot of control of what's happening in it, and you also don't have to spend a lot of time working out what other people's code is doing that's already there, which is always nice. So yeah, you get to spend a lot of time just designing the system you want to write to solve the problem being given to solve, basically, and you do get a lot of autonomy over that, which is always cool.
Yeah, we generally only have one developer working on a microservice.
Yeah.
I know this definition is a bit loose, and in some bigger companies, you'll see them talk about a microservice is something that one team owns. So maybe at a Netflix or something like that, it will be one team just doing their microservices for customer authentication or something like that. For us, they're small enough that we would expect you and one developer on them part of the time. I've forgotten at the moment. So, Phil, how about you?
I think my favorite part has actually just been getting to work on logic problems. I think it's a nice change from the front end. You do definitely still have a lot of complex issues on the front end that you can run into. Typically, when there's a bug, the most complex thing you come across, trying to track down what's going wrong. But I think the scope of the problem you need to approach is much smaller than a microservice. Probably appropriate for the name. Yeah, it's been quite enjoyable. You get the like aha moment where you fix stuff.
Yeah.
Like for example, in calculating the discounts for one of my clients. My initial implementation was, I thought it was okay, but the 12 looked at it and was like, I don't understand what this is doing. And when I look at it again, I'm like, yeah, okay, maybe it's a bit crap. So probably the most fun part is getting to refine and fix things and make them like relatively efficient. In this case, it needs to be quite efficient because it's going to be used so many times, which is I think probably a bit of a rare use case for microservices. It can be called like 20 times simultaneously below the PDP.
Yeah. Definitely different considerations from other areas.
So I think getting that from a pretty bad spot into a good spot where it's actually completely different, but it works better and it's faster and it's correct is really fun. So I really enjoy that aspect of it, I think. I will say, whether you're working on front end or microservices, APIs suck everywhere. So on the front end, they're still quite difficult. There's one I'm working with, but I do both.
We sometimes have to build our own small APIs, and I think that's a really useful learning experience because then you understand why they're not great to work with. They're really hard to build, so that they're nice for the end user. Yeah.
Exactly. And like I said, they're not documented well typically, so you kind of have to just trial and error in some cases. But it doesn't make a difference where you're working with in which case.
Daniel?
I think that's great, Ashley. The system design part is really fun. I think especially once you've built it and you get it running for the first time, that is really satisfying. We use a technology called step functions, which is a really nice visual tool as well, but you can visualize it, links a lot of functions together in like a flow chart sort of way. And when a step completes successfully, it goes green. And when you run the step function for the first time and everything lights up green, it is very satisfying.
So you're going through like function
by
function, green.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it is. It's very satisfying. And especially when you can line that flow chart that you've generated in code up to your original design, and you can sort of, map and go, oh, cool, it's there, and it's all successful. That's really good. I think that's one of my favorite parts.
Yeah. Step functions is super.
Yeah.
I think we're happy to throw to some questions now, if anyone has. Yeah.
So it sounds like a lot of your microservices tend to be like more focused on the integration between like APIs and your databases or whatever. Do you have any examples that aren't integrations?
Not right now. It is in the pipeline. I would not be surprised if in the future we're doing more direct from the website kind of stuff. So instead of having to ask for some piece of information for a customer, go through the back end, go through a microservice, go through some external service, fetch that, come back all the way through that big path. We'll probably build our own little API for various reasons, for simplicity, so that we can cache things that are requested or to hide implementation, whatever crazy implementation the end service has. Yeah. Is there anything else you're thinking of? I mean, I guess that's still technically an integration.
Yeah. At a previous company I worked at, we basically built our entire API out of small microservices. So we had like 7 microservices for users, and it had its own database of just the users, and it in like a couple little functions handled like all user authentication and stuff like that. And then we had like other microservices for other objects in different databases, and that would like talk to the user's microservice to like validate authentication, things like that. And I don't know, I thought that was a pretty fun structure to work with. Like you have this little piece of code that handles one very specific part of an overall large API.
Yeah, I have had this chat with the managing director before of whether at some point we want to start being a bit more of a product company, and that might get more into that space if we do. But I suspect that's unlikely because building your own version of one of these systems, like Ashley was describing, is a lot of hard work. And
It's like error prone too.
Yeah.
yeah,
Because when you have like the confidence works of like 15 systems talking to each other, it's like,
yeah, and it's not the problem that clients are coming to us to solve at the moment.
I actually think there's a lot of that integration. Like, oh, we've got this system that needs to talk to this other thing. Like, make it happen. That's your job. Wait.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But I think some of the technologies we're working with are already in this space or are themselves looking to move more towards kind of distributed microservices, customizability and so on. So it's the way that a lot of e-commerce is going. So I don't know, I think there's some exciting possibilities.
Yeah, so what stops you, or what makes it so hard to like spin up a local instance and test?
Someone want to talk about this?
Sure. So because we're working with a cloud environment, having a local instance kind of involves replicating the entire cloud on a local machine. If you want a perfect replication. So you can try your best, and we have a tool called LocalStack that does do it pretty well. But occasionally there's things you run into that doesn't quite behave the same as it would on the cloud. One of the big examples for me in one of my projects, we have a complicated networking setup in AWS. So they have one of their backend services runs on their local network, so in their Adelaide office, I think. So we need to connect to that from the cloud, which involves having a VPC peering connection. So it essentially routes through AWS back to their internal system, and we can talk to the API that way. Replicating that locally is near impossible, and if it was possible, it's a security risk. So we pretty much can't do local development on that.
It's one of these ones that's just a MacBook in someone's office.
It wouldn't surprise me if it is.
Some clients have systems that are basically just run on like a single laptop.
It's just a spreadsheet open
You'd be surprised.
on some Windows XP box. Yeah. So we can't necessarily do like end-to-end testing locally. We would normally deploy to AWS and then do some testing there. We can, however, run unit tests and stuff locally if you want to test logic, but generally we don't test API calls.
Yeah, we're
unit
starting
tests.
to move in that direction. I've seen a
Yeah.
couple cases where it was worth, you essentially have to write some code to pretend that the API has given you a response, and that's one way to do it. One of the big problems here is just that we use other people's tools. So we use Serverless Framework, which is a tool some other people have written so that you don't have to write a lot of the really messy configuration code that AWS requires. So our development experience is nicer. But then if you want to integrate that with one of the local kind of pseudo AWS solutions, you have to use a plugin that someone else has written. That plugin doesn't support everything that we use in AWS and then we have other plugins that we use to allow us to use those things in AWS, but they don't work with the other plugin because they're all written by totally different people. So that's a big part of the problem. It's very easy to get 80% of the way there and go, yeah, this is great. I can do everything locally. And then you find the one thing that doesn't work. And you're like, okay, now I guess I have to go back to deploying directly to the cloud. It's something we've run into probably 3 or 4 times because every now and then someone says, I finally solved it, and they haven't solved it yet.
I think it's pretty painless anyway. It's just a command. You just the bad part's the wait.
Yeah.
I've gotten used to it, yeah. Yeah.
You just go get a coffee or something. Come back
I
and
once
you
went to a
just-
talk with someone else using, I don't know what the AWS has their own local SAM. And they were like, this is great. I can test all my lambdas locally, etc. And they demoed it live, and it took longer than it would have taken them to deploy to AWS. I don't understand. You could go and make a coffee in the time it took for the whole thing to spin up the local environment, replicate everything, deploy to their environment. It just didn't make any sense.
Some things in AWS are very slow. I had to deploy something multiple times yesterday, and each time took about 15 minutes.
Wow.
And it was
Oh,
on
that's
AWS.
outrageous.
Yeah, CloudFront.
Not everything's necessarily that bad. If you're just working on one function, for example, you can deploy just the function rather than the whole stack, and it will take like a few seconds. And then you can just test it within AWS. It's not always a single thing.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Just curious, when you go to microservices and it's like engineers map different functions that be able to make it go, where does the costing on that, because it's a different type of front. But how do you go about?
Who wants to talk about estimation?
How do you go about presenting a business case to your customer?
Probably cheaper than most people assume in the first place anyway.
There's a lot of different things. So if we're talking about running costs, yes, it's actually, you have to be doing a lot of work on AWS to spend even $1. The main risk is that your account gets hacked and someone does a lot of work, and then you have to go to AWS and say, please, I don't want to pay this bill. I've seen that a lot with people doing hobby development there. We have kind of a whole process that happens before it gets to microservice development. I'm not even involved in a lot of that. So there's the sales process. We do work with the BAs and TAs. They will come up with, well, here's all the requirements, here's the systems that the client wants to use, here's the data, here's the information we have right now. There's always additional requirements that come up as you actually build the thing. And they'll come in, they'll work with the dev and say, how long do you think all these things will take? We might try and use previous jobs as kind of a reference point. I'll often come in at the end of that process and sort of eyeball everything and say, no, that's definitely going to take 2 weeks, not 3 days. And then there's the sales negotiation again, and pricing and all that, which we're not really part of either. So it's a long and involved process. A lot of people in the company will work on one project. Yeah.
How would you say it compares to the standard of previous systems?
I'm honestly not sure, because I have not seen the numbers for how much they're
I'm just
costing.
curious whether like you have to present both cases to the customer and they kind of choose, or you haven't had to go down that path yet.
That's definitely something that the sales and upper management will be doing with the client. Yeah. They'll be saying what we think we should do it this way. And there's a back and forth discovery process as well. They'll come to me or the microservice devs and say, can we do this with a microservice? What are the positives and negatives, that sort of stuff. Yeah, interesting question.
There's also a difference in terms of ongoing costs and ongoing maintenance and things like that, which I guess you could use to help with sales process, things like that. So it's like a lot.
Yeah, ideally, long-term part of the benefit of microservices is it should cost less to maintain them.
I think it is very important to note, like, just how cheap they are to run. Like, just on my own AWS account that I use, like my own personal projects, I'm running like 4 or 5 like full stack things, and I'm paying $53 a month. Like, it's very, very cheap
That's like
to run on.
the first million Lambda executions or something is totally free. You have a question?
Ben just mentioned about documentation part of things. So I'm super curious, like, is when your business is starting out, do you have a person that documentation? And so when you're onboarding a new staff, how can the documentation part can you make it more efficient for this new staff to understand? Microservices?
What should we do, Ashley, when we're onboarding people onto a microservice that exists or an existing project or something? What would you like to see in terms of documentation? Or what are you trying to do so that the next person who has to work on your system doesn't have the same nightmarish time?
In the perfect ideal world, we would have great written documentation about how every aspect of it works. I don't think that's an entirely achievable goal though. So, I mean, what I spend a lot of time doing is documenting my functions within the code. So like we use TypeScript, and TypeScript has this thing called JS docs, which is a special type of comment you can put above a function and kind of explain what it does and how those inputs work. The advantage of documenting that way is when you go to change the function, the documentation is right above it and you can see that they're inconsistent now, so it kind of prompts you to update the documentation. And the really cool thing is in most text editors like VS Code, stuff like that, you will get that text pop up for autocomplete when you're trying to use the function. And on top of that, I think just clear function names, like writing really clear and easy to use code with like in-code documentation is probably the most effective way I've found of documenting things for other people. And people can just open things up and just read through the code and kind of know what's happening.
Yeah, I agree. Good code is definitely the starting point. Tests are probably the second one. I often, if I'm asked by the client, what do we do with this attribute on a product or something like that? Usually the first place I will go is, well, I know that we have some test cases that say if we get this in, we'll get this out. And if they're passing, we think the code is doing the right thing. So I'll go and look at the actual data that we are putting into those test cases. It's just much more efficient than trying to dig through the code and say, is it handling it here? Is it doing this? It's like, it's coming in here and, oh, it's not coming out there. All right, we get rid of that attribute, something like that. Written documentation is something we're working on. It's not in a great state at the moment for a lot of our services for various reasons. I'm going through on a couple and trying to update them and add things like stuff that you can't really tell from the code, like how do you run this? What should you put in? What are the options for running it? What are the things that, how are the ways it'll fail? That sort of stuff. I think a lot of those things. And then the next battle is to get people to actually read those when they first encounter a service, because to be fair to our developers, I don't go to the README initially when I look at a service either, because so many of them have not been great so far. Documentation is definitely an ongoing battle. And then there's all of the built up knowledge, especially when we're dealing with external services. You know, where do you find the documentation for this other service? What's the stuff that's not written there? We have no control over their documentation. What are the things that we've learned that they might not even know about their own system?
What do you think about the documentation?
I think it's pretty good, to be honest. Like the reference documentation is generally pretty good. I link to it a lot. I've spent a lot of time reading it. I don't know how everyone else has found it.
It's certainly not like entirely perfect, but it's definitely one of the better like documentation that I've worked with.
Some of it's quite in depth as well.
Yeah.
Like if you read through the Lambda documentation, I actually found it really helpful. Where the things where maybe I hadn't understood it watching a Udemy video, for example, but then I go read the documentation and actually some of it reworded, I guess, the way they've chosen to word it actually is really helpful. So I find it quite good as well.
I also use like that.
What do we do?
It's sort of less version control in the cloud. So we have we use Bitbucket as our version control in 99% of cases. Then developers will work on the features. They'll generally work on feature branches with ticket numbers assigned to those features. Then when we are ready, that feature is complete and we're ready to deploy to a staging environment, we'll then create a PR from that feature branch into staging. From there, pipelines take over, and once it's approved and merged, everything gets deployed to a staging environment. So it's not necessarily version. I don't know if version control is the right word. But we have a staging environment and we have a production environment. So the idea is that once these features are complete, they go to staging, the client can do testing, we can do testing to make sure everything's still working. And then once we're sure that, well, as sure as you can be that there are as minimal bugs as possible and that those features are correct, we would then merge staging into production. And at that point, it would go live.
I think also because a lot of the tools we're developing are like internal tools for our developers to use and for just the systems we're working with to use. It's not very important to have like previous versions of those services active and accessible, because like when we update them, we're all at the same company. We can make sure everybody else is using the newest version kind of thing. So we don't really have to deal with issues that like public APIs will deal with, where you've still got like some company who's using your 13-year-old version 1 of your API. So yeah, I think having like multiple live versions is really a concern for us. It's just making sure that our actual code is managed in Git, and so we can like revert back if something goes wrong. Sort of thing.
Yeah, we may not be quite as mature as I'd like in that area. You can do version control on a lot of the resources in AWS. At least you can version your Lambda function.
Yeah,
step
I was
functions
asking
and
if
things like
you
that.
don't think Lambda functions and service functions, how you actually manually upload them, or is it part of the
No, so as
CI/CD?
Daniel described, we have a CI/CD pipeline with a bunch of checks. So on a feature branch, when you commit that or run the test parts of that pipeline, staging a production, we'll do an automated deploy. So if we needed to revert, it would probably involve reverting the actual change in our source control and then doing the automated deploy based on that. One of the nice things about the way that we work is you basically get the change immediately. There's zero downtime. So if I deploy a change to a step function or a Lambda function, I can just run it immediately and it's the new version, which is really convenient for the development flow.
Yeah, serverless abstracts away a lot of the problems you would have. So serverless generates CloudFormation in the background, which is then pushed up to AWS. That then handles Lambda versioning, step function versioning, all that kind of stuff. So Lambda still will have versioning, I guess, obviously starting at 1, and then, you know, with every single release of staging, it will increment that. But you sort of don't see that as a developer. It's just kind of happening in the background that you're trusting it's working.
Our actual process for deploying things is kind of just like clicking a button and then code that like the DevOps guys, right, kind of take what's in our code base and deploy that in like the same way every time. So it's quite reliable.
Yeah. This is something as we start to work with non-AWS platforms, we might actually learn more about where the sharp edges are there. I think when you're going to use one tool ever, you kind of just go, well, that's how it works. And it'll be interesting to see how the platforms enforce different standards and like this change our processes. I think a lot of it really, the way we work is derived from the way that backend works at Aligent 2. Microservices is still pretty new, so our process is 90% the same as the way that may diverge more in the future.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Oh. No more questions? Thanks for coming out. I hope you all got something out of it.
Maybe on the chat.
Oh, I've not been looking at the chat.
There was a
Yeah,
chat.
if they hear anything.
The whole time they've been complaining they can't.
What languages do we program in?
My favorite, TypeScript.
Ashley's the resident TypeScript expert, basically.
Yeah. TypeScript is basically just JavaScript with types added on top. So like numbers and strings and things like that. Because by default, JavaScript doesn't enforce that sort of thing. Where you can create a number and then set it to be equal to a string, whereas TypeScript will tell you after doing that. And it also gives you much better in-code documentation, because you can see in your functions, it wants you to pass in a string and then 2 numbers and a boolean, rather than just seeing like 4 variable names.
TypeScript, you're really what you learned to program in? Or?
No, I learned to program with Java. And then I went to JavaScript and then C, C++, and then TypeScript.
Yeah. I think for front-end developers, you're generally doing JavaScript or
Yeah,
did you do
I
TypeScript
started
before?
with C, C++, and then when I moved to or started at Aligent, it was just JavaScript, yeah. Which kind of made the transition to microservices pretty easy. I think I did just ignore the type stuff initially, and it still kind of works. So
That is the thing I just like most about TypeScript, is you can just ignore the type stuff and just write normal JavaScript.
Even
and
worse,
then-
you can write bad types.
Yeah. And it just makes you very sad. But
yeah, you wouldn't have liked my initial PRs and stuff. But yeah, that's definitely part of the easy part, I guess, of going from front end to microservices. It's quite familiar.
What were you programming in before?
Primarily Python. Yeah, started at uni with, started with C, uni Java, C++. Was the main, like I started with the previous job. And Aligent. In non-microservice areas in DevOps, we do use TypeScript quite a bit, but we also use a little bit of Python, a little bit of Rust, kind of just whatever we're feeling at the time, I guess. But TypeScript is probably the main language we use across DevOps and microservices.
I think TypeScript is nice just because the ecosystem is so huge that packages for everything is really commonly used. Basically become one of the fact that web languages, React's got to be a big part of it, I think. We have a lot of PHP developers, and some of those moved into microservices, and I know that some of them would be more comfortable writing in PHP, which we may end up doing if there's the right project and development combination. Jared always talking about writing some language he loves. I can't remember. Not every language is supported by all the platforms, but AWS at least supports a pretty wide variety of languages.
And you can write your own custom runtimes as well.
Yeah.
So theoretically, it supports everything.
Yeah.
But not native. Native, I think, is TypeScript, Python.
One of the biggest considerations for cloud is because the way that cloud runs, there is what we call a cold start. So if you have a Lambda function up in AWS and you want to run it, AWS kind of has to, the first time you run it, it has to build all the infrastructure and put the code in there. It takes a little time before you actually get your code running. And then the Lambda's hot for a little while where AWS says, well, I'll keep this around for a bit. And subsequent requests to run that don't have that startup cost. Some languages take longer to start up than others. JavaScript is pretty fast. I think Python is pretty fast.
I'll be faster.
Languages, might be. Languages like C#, where there's a much more scaffolding around, which can be nice for a developer experience, also often means that there's a lot more work to do just to get the container going so you can actually run. So there are definitely some trade-offs with language choice. But at the moment, it's just TypeScript.
We use Rust for internal tool. Hard to explain what that actually does, but it's kind of like a tool we use for abstracting away a lot of Docker commands in our backend environment.
It's Vessel.
Yeah. So it used to be a giant bash script that was really messy, and it still is. We're still using that for most of our projects, but we've started, writing it in Rust because it's much easier to maintain, and Rust is cool. So
Vessel's pretty cool. It's like a wrapper around a container around the Magento CLI and some other stuff.
it abstracts away a lot.
It does make working with this much easier.
So instead of relying on developers to know how Docker functions and how to connect to containers and restart and stop and build containers and all that, we just have a thing called Vessel where you can essentially just run Vessel start or Vessel connect or whatever, and you can do everything you need to do. So just to help with the development
Cool. Explains why I couldn't just Google for.
Yes.
It's not working. Comes up with shits. Makes sense now. Are there any other online questions? Or is that it?
No, I think that was it.
Excellent. Thanks very much for having us.
Thank you so much. And we prepared the morning tea over there, so you guys can like,
I will
you want to
partake.
check if stuff from Aligent and then any morning tea together, and, like have some nice coffee.
There's no expectation to stick around,
I need to ask.
I woke up at 9 this morning.
These chairs come from over there.
Oh, no, I can put it back. Don't worry. About that. Yes. Thank you so much.
If you want to take the camera off.
It's harder than.